the idea of this presentation is to kind of review some things about Promotion Manager Wizard. Promotion Manager Wizard is used for migrating content. So if you're moving up to 4.3 SP2 or SP3 coming out in December, yay! I love that last presentation because there's so many times that you're trying to do a query of a query, or you have a, what Sam was showing as far as like, the idea of passing values, and you're limited to a certain amount of values that you can pass to another query. And so you come across these limitations of queries interacting with other queries, and a left join is so awesome. And it's just, there's times that you'll come up against it that what they just showed was so such a good change. But so I'm excited for SP3. So this could be shown as, you'll still do this for SP3 as well, in terms of migrating over using Promotion Manager Wizard. So let's talk about this. So how do you ask a wizard to migrate? You use Promotion Manager Wizard, of course. Okay, so that's just hokey. That's just the hook. All right, so Promotion Manager Wizard is a client tool that's installed with your server tools. So it's an administrative tool. So some of you who are just users that use web intelligence are probably bored by this presentation, but it's always good to know what's happening in the background. So, and things to ask about, and things to suggest, and to know what administrators can do for you. So all those things are good. So a couple of things to note, when you use Promotion Manager Wizard, there is an INI file that has a few settings in it, but two of the settings I find to be extremely useful and that I always change. So there's some settings that I might change in specific situations, but there's definitely two settings that I always change. And that is, I increase the memory that's given to the Promotion Manager Wizard so that it can take more processing power and work faster. Certainly if you have a large environment that you're migrating from one server to another, you'll want that memory. The other thing that I change as well is to set the date parameter. There's a parameter in there that allows you that instead of when it migrates the data, it doesn't pick up the date of the migration, because then that changes the last modified date to the date of the migration. That's not really the last time that report was modified. That report was modified, when it was edited in web intelligence, so to speak. So what you really want is to keep that last modified date. So I always change that back to the keep last. And that lets you do things like figure out, whether or not people are using the report, needs to be archived, and those kinds of things. So it's always good to know to keep the last modified date as a real last modified date instead of the migration date. So I do change those in the INI file, and I just want to point those out. Another thing is when you open up Promotion Manager Wizard, there is a text space for a temp folder, and if your temp folder doesn't have enough space, and often you are moving gigabytes of information from one environment to another, so especially when you're moving instances, so you'll want to point it to a space that has more available. And if you just leave it as is, it'll be the temp space of the user that is logged in, and that's usually limited in terms of the people running the server. So you'll want to create a folder that's a temp folder that you point to with the Promotion Manager Wizard. Also, I like to set up an easy access, separate log file location. So I will point it to a log file location of my choice as well, so that I can look at the log files to see, what was successful, what was not successful, what was ignored, those kinds of things. So I often will change those. So what those look like, here's an example of the Promotion Manager Wizard INI file. So I would go in and I would change the default amount of memory, max memory. Of course, there's a min memory, but max memory that I give it. So I would usually bring that up to about 20, or depending on how big the environment is, what I have available to me. And then here's the time setting. So by default, it's legacy, which legacy just means that it will pick up the the way that the code will work like in legacy mode is it will pick up the migration date. So again, that's not the date you want. You don't want everything to be, November 9th or 10th. You want it to be whatever it was last modified. So I changed that to keep TS, and then the actual last modified date will stay. And then in the Promotion Manager Wizard client, when I open it up, like I said, I would specify a temp folder and specify a login location. So those are typically the things that I do just to make it work the way that I want to. Okay. In terms of working with the Promotion Manager Wizard, when you're migrating, you'll want to always pull from the latest version. You're probably used to that from previous migrations, but just to remind, you always want to start with the latest version is the environment that you are working in, and then you pull from source to that destination. So so that's the idea, and of course that makes sense because when you do a migration, you are upgrading to the latest version, and so you want to be working with the code from the latest version. So it makes sense. So there you have options on the next step. So once you've decided the central CMS that you're going to use, then you have options in terms of exporting to an LCMVIR file, so a little archive file that you can then move as a file, or you could do a live to live, or you could import of an LCMVIR file that you created previously from the old environment. Most of you will want to be doing a live to live. I would recommend doing a live to live. It's easier to manage, etc. So I'm just going to kind of talk about that. So once you, like I said, once you've got your central CMS, which is generally you're pulling from the newest environment, then you choose your source. So this is the old environment, the 4.2, and your destination. And if you're pulling into the new, you can just click the checkbox and it'll then use that new environment. If you're using a third environment to pull, like if you're using your development 4.3 SP2 environment to 4.3 environment to promote to production, then obviously your destination would be different from your environment that you're working with. And I should say back there, the ports that need to be open in that case in order to connect and so forth, of course, you'll need your CMS ports. If you're a small environment, you can do a full live to live, so the full content promotion, which is the next tab in on the wizard, but most of us are going to be doing the select content promotion. So even a medium environment, even a small medium, range environment will want to do a selective content promotion. So it just depends on how big your environment is. But I would say most of us are going to want to do selective. If you do selective, then you'll want to do certain things in order. So you'll want to bring over your users first and your users and groups. And you'll want to bring over, things according to the dependencies and then on up to your reports. So, so there is an order that you'll want to do things in when you first bring things over. There's also to note a partial update. So you notice this apply time filter option. So if you change this over to selective content promotion, then you do also have the ability to select for anything that's changed or has a time associated with it, or a last modified, basically, a time associated with it that is, recent. So as you promote, if you're working with a migration, you're doing testing, you did an initial migration, and then you're testing, and while you're testing, you're wanting to do another migration, you can just promote the stuff that is incremental, that's changed. So, and of course, that's very useful. So you can turn that on and it will filter what you choose over on the left side. So as I said, order matters. So you want to bring over your access levels because those are applied to your security that then affect your users and groups, and their access to connections, which then has universes have access to connections, documents have access to universes, and other information then after that. So generally, you want to make sure you do it in a certain order. When it comes to users and groups, if you're migrating over, you usually want to set up your, at least this is the way I do it. I usually set up my authentication first. And so I make sure my authentication works. I make sure my authentication, if it's Active Directory, for example, brings over users with the groups that I add. So I make sure that it works. And then I delete those users because I want my keywords to be the same, my unique identifiers. I want them to be the same between the old environment and the new, even for the users. So I will make sure my authentication works, then I will remove those users. I can keep the group, the Active Directory group, because that's its own thing. But then I would then migrate over the old to the new. So just to note as far as authentication goes. So you do have options over, if I go back a couple screens, you see this button right here on the top right. There's an options button, and in that options window will pop up. Basically, these are the default settings. So what to note here is that by default, all your instances are brought over. So if you don't want your instances brought over right away, then you would want to select don't. Note also that the dependencies are brought over by default. So if you have any shortcuts, then the report that the shortcut is pointing to will be brought over if you have that selected. If you don't have that selected, that shortcut won't work. So you have to bring it over at the same time. So that's an important thing when it comes to shortcuts. In general, I like to keep these on and bring them on over so that all my dependencies work. Security, however, is something that you might do, once every few times. So you might bring, of course, everything over and then bring over security and so forth. So security is something you'll do after, of course, you have access levels and you have your users and groups, and then you'll bring over your security. And then there's the other options, things like group BI preferences. I found that the BI Fiori going to 4.3, since it's a Fiori as opposed to the old BI, isn't working as one-to-one for me. So I've had to recreate these in a few instances. So you may have to recreate these in the 4.3 environment because it's Fiori, if it's the BI Launchpad preferences. Time filter, great for new objects since last migration. So like I said, you would go in and you change the time, you check this, and then when you check all folders or check anything, it'll be just the stuff that's changed. So that's super helpful to make, instead of having to bring over all folders as you do over time, you can just bring over the stuff that's different. Unfortunately, the time filter doesn't do a couple of things. So if you've got instances that have been brought over or instances that have been created, so those are new, but the object itself isn't new, then it won't pick them up. So the time filter doesn't see that the object is new because the instances have been there. So if you want to bring over the instances, you got to bring those over separately. And so there is the need to use the client LCM, lifecycle management, which is just a code based off of a property file. So I gave examples of the export queries that you would use if you're trying to bring over from the main folder, the public folder, the inboxes, and the favorites. Run compare reports to confirm. So a couple of things that we do in addition as we go, just to make sure that we have everything that we want between the two environments, is we have reports that we run. Here's if we're bringing over, we have the old environment, so we have a CMS query against that, using the CMS universe against that old environment, and then we have a CMS query with the new environment, and we then using the count of the QID all, we merge on QID, do a count of QID all. That's if you look up VLOOKUP options in BusinessObjects, that'll help you with that. But anyway, we do that to create the compare report, and then we've got an idea of whether or not they match. So we have two reports in there, things that are to be deleted. So if meanwhile, while we've been doing the migration, something has been deleted in the old environment, then we want to delete it in the new environment. Same thing with if something's been added to the old environment, we want to make sure that the migration worked to add it in the new environment. So we run these compare reports just to confirm. It's also good for, giving to our clients to confirm. So all of that is important. There's also some useful scripts that we have that we use when we're doing the deletions. So the deletions are, all over the place, right? And so to make it easier on us to do the deletions rather than having to individually go in and select each one to delete, we have a script that picks that up from an Excel spreadsheet. So we can move those all to an archive folder and then delete those from the archive folder. So it's a script that we use for archiving as well. And then it's also generally good in overall. There's an SAP script that's been out there forever for administrators called RepoScan. And then when you're working with a migration, you want to make sure that you RepoScan before and after. So you're getting rid of any orphans, anything that exists in your file store that doesn't exist in your CMS database, and vice versa. Anything that exists in your CMS database, the pointer to the file exists, but the file doesn't exist, then you want to clean those things up and have a nice clean environment to move to. Fewer errors in a clean environment, of course. So RepoScan, recommend as well. That's a script that's been around for a while, but I just want to mention it because it's part of the migration process. Lastly, there is down in the bottom, there in the little question mark will get you to the link that BusinessObjects provides or SAP provides for Promotion Management Wizard that has a lot of information that I've given you, and as any additional information, for example, using it with Linux. So there's other information that you might find useful there. All right, so that's all I got. Anybody have any questions? Time to get kids in bed.
That was from Sam and Gregory because of the difference of time.
Yeah,
we kept them up quite late today.
Yeah, see, their presentation is so much more exciting. So how do you get a duck to migrate? They migrate on their own. You don't have to do anything. You just change the weather. Come on.
Well, it seems that we have a question that came in through the through the Q&A.
Okay.
It reads as, back in 3.x version, we had an option called copy data source, where we can simply restore the backed up CMS metadata and update the data source. Do we still have that option?
So yes, you do. That still exists in your CCM. You still have the ability to move your CMS data source and update it to the latest. That is not considered. If you look at recommendations from SAP, it's generally not considered recommended for a migration, because the migration process actually does update the individual objects as it works. So you want to actually, rather than, because your environment works with both a CMS database and the file store. The CMS database points to the files. So in a migration situation, you really want to upgrade those files for a clean migration, and you're also doing, often you're doing testing, and there's, those kinds of things that you have to set up. But there is the option to do that. That's usually used for disaster recovery more than it is used for that method of just transferring over a CMS and then, upgrading it. That's really used for disaster recovery more than it is a migration.
Well, a couple of more questions. Why use the Promotion Management Wizard instead of just using the LCM CLI batch?
Yeah, so you can use the LCM CLI batch. I mean, using the wizard for just general stuff, for doing the, the time thing. I mean, you can do everything with the CLM, the client tool, the the one with that's just scripting as opposed to using a GUI. So depending on your level, and I do use the CLM or LCM CLI for the inbox stuff. I like using the GUI for the rest of it because it's just easier to use and it's quicker. So that's 6 one way, half dozen the other. As far as the CMC GUI, so the LCM, promotion management in the CMC, you will of course be working through Tomcat and have some limitations in terms of how much you can move at one time when you're doing it with the CMC. So you probably, that one you would not want to do, but everything else makes sense, either way in terms of the batch client or the promotion manager wizard. Wizards are just, easy to work with. I just want to point out that the instances that have changed, you would move over with the client tool as far as a limitation that the wizard has. But the wizard is just easier to use.
Awesome. One more question. Can you use the promotion management wizard allow for creating a properties file that can be reused with the LCM CLI tool?
I'm not aware of one of that working. I haven't tried to do that. So, I always want to qualify things with not to my knowledge, but my knowledge is not, 100% as nobody's is. So not to my knowledge.
Awesome. So one more question. In your experience migrating environment, what is the most time-consuming task, or where do you have to be more detailed or careful?
Testing, and more testing.
We get that. So, I think it's testing.
It was testing. So every enterprise software is going to be different, and BusinessObjects is no exception. So it's a huge enterprise software tool that has, over time built even bigger and bigger, and got more capabilities and is more useful. And every environment uses it differently, because once you unleash something, everybody tries to make the most of it. So that the testing is very, very important, and you will find things that weren't caught in SAP's testing. That's the way software works. So I definitely would recommend a lot of regression testing. There's some options in terms of running reports in bulk and then comparing them between the two environments. So we do some regression testing options with InfoBurst. There is also a tool that we work with Wisdom that has 360 bind that's good for regression testing as well. So there's some good regression testing in bulk options, but it really comes down to really hitting the new environment with all the things that you do with it in your specific environment. So yes, testing.
Testing, definitely. Do you follow a project plan to migrate objects, like number 1 for security, groups, users, etc.? Number 2, connections, universes. Number 3, content, webby instances.
Yeah, exactly. So I think earlier in the slides, if you go back a little bit, I mentioned that if you're doing it live to live, doing the whole thing, a full migration, you don't have to do this. But if you're doing a piecemeal, then you definitely want to do it in order. So you want to do it with your access levels, because that's your security settings that are grouped. Then you want to do users and groups, and then you want to do connections, and then universes, and then reports, and then things like calendars and things like that. So there is a stepwise in terms of content, but there's also a project plan that we standardly use for migrating in general, that we have various, depending on the size or the specific requirements that a client has, we modify, but we have a basic migration project plan for sure.
Awesome. Well, I think I don't see any further questions at the moment. Just give it a minute, maybe. Well, Yeah, I think, yeah, well, by the way, you sound amazing. Please don't get shy by your cold.
So the cold works. It makes your voice better. That's great.
Maybe. Maybe.
Positive spin, positive spin. All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amy.